In New York, a catastrophic crane collapse in downtown Manhattan.
Holy cow! It suddenly became a war scene. Everything on this side of the block was totally crushed.
Disaster strikes a construction project in Texas.
This was a mistake that might have led to some tragic consequences.
In California, danger lurks beneath San Francisco's Bayside towers.
Buildings could be pulled off their foundations. I mean, it could be apocalyptic.
And in Germany, a thwarted attempt to remake Berlin on a nightmarish scale.
Some people say that Germania was a fantasy, was far too ambitious. It was impossible to build.
With big builds, even the smallest fail can trigger a huge disaster. From miscalculations to misunderstandings, or just plain bad luck. These catastrophes are every engineer's worst nightmare. Big engineering can make a lasting mark on a city skyline. But like any construction project, just one mistake can lead to disaster. Like this catastrophe in New York that gave residents a rude awakening.
We were still in bed, we heard a crash and we felt the building move. Get dressed, see what the hell's going on.
A tragedy where mammoth engineering came up against the might of Mother Nature.
She's moving fast now. Oh, it broke!
Ultimately, this was beyond the point of no return, and the entire system toppled over.
This devastating collapse caused chaos on the streets of Manhattan.
When a crane this magnitude collapses onto the New York City streetscape, it's major news.
New York, the Big Apple, is the city with a world-famous skyline.
Engineers have been building big in Manhattan for well over 100 years. And for much of the 20th century, the city held the title for the world's tallest building with a series of gravity-defying towers.
Nowhere more so than in the financial powerhouse of Lower Manhattan. Born and bred New Yorker and city planner, Josh Vogel knows all about this area's bold high-rise history.
Banks and large companies started to build skyscrapers. They did that with the intent of kind of showcasing their wealth and their strength to the city.
The climb skywards continues today, but it started more than a century ago.
It's really amazing to think how old some of these buildings are and how historic of a city New York City actually is. We have buildings that are 100, 150 years old that are still standing today.
Sometimes this historic cityscape needs a helping hand to meet the needs of a modern-day metropolis.
Over time, there are different factors at play, like being more environmentally friendly, retrograding them for energy efficiency. But overall, as long as these buildings are upkept and taken care of, there's no time limit on them.
Maintaining these aging giants in an already crowded city is no easy task. Adrian Brügger is a civil engineer.
Arguably, this is one of the most challenging places to actually have to lift a load in the world. If you go downtown, specifically the financial district area, the streets are extremely tight. So this is the old part of the city. The streets were built for small buildings and then replaced by skyscrapers. You can imagine there's very little room to move.
In early 2016, one historic building needed to upgrade its modern utilities. So work began to install air conditioning units on the roof, more than 100 meters up.
This Art Deco office block is more than 20 stories tall, so it needed a monster machine to match. Luckily, everything is big in Manhattan, and that includes the cranes.
These cranes are massive, often taller than the building that they're building. You have a crane that's 3-4 blocks long, brought in on large tractor trailers, and then they're assembled here on site.
To hoist the cooling units high into position, engineers would be using a giant crawler crane with a boom around 60 meters long, attached to a 113-meter arm, known as a luffing jib.
The mission of this crane was to pick these loads up from the street and then literally turn and reach over a building and drop it more or less at the center of the roof. The luffing jib is this attachment to the boom that essentially gives you extra reach. It's almost like you're reaching into a kitchen cabinet. It's your hand that will be the luffing jib, where you can go to the back of a cabinet and pull out marmalade or whatever's in the cabinet.
These cranes don't just need great reach. With narrow streets lined by tall buildings, maneuverability is key. That's why it had to be a crawler crane.
One of the most amazing things about these cranes is that they're in no way tied to the ground. It's only through counterweights that are in the back of the crawler unit and just careful movement of the jib and the boom that the crane does not topple over.
But in a city that's the setting for many disaster movies, a catastrophe was about to play out in real life. Friday, February the 5th, 2016. Local resident of 30 years, Mark Goldman, was asleep in his lower Manhattan apartment.
About 8:30 in the morning, we were still in bed. We heard a crash and we felt the building move. Literally, the building shook. It was, get dressed, see what the hell's going on.
Mark's booming wake-up call was caused by this.
Okay, we're on the 30th floor now, and the crane's starting to move again.
Workers in a nearby office building captured the dramatic scene unfolding.
There he goes, he's moving fast now. He's dropping it really quick now. Whoa! Oh, it broke!
The 173-meter crawler crane boom and jib crashed down onto the streets below.
I was shocked. We came out the door and we see this massive crane, a whole row of crushed cars.
First responders rushed to the scene.
Within 10 minutes, we had police, firemen. It suddenly became a war scene. Everything on this side of the block was totally crushed.
More than 100 tons of metal was lying in a twisted mess on the streets of Manhattan.
The crane is like 3 blocks long. It's a monstrous thing. All you saw was crane.
City planner Josh Vogel was in his office nearby when he heard the devastating news.
It started a block down at the base on Hudson Street. It passed this area right here, and then it landed another block up on Church. This is not a normal occurrence. So when a crane, especially of this magnitude, collapses onto the New York City streetscape, it's major news.
The impact had damaged more than just the streets, rupturing gas pipelines, forcing an evacuation of nearby residents.
This was not a good situation. We smelled gas. We knew we'd have to evacuate. It was obvious.
While buildings escaped largely unscathed, 3 people were injured in the disaster, including the crane operator. And tragically, 1 passerby was killed. As the city reeled, New Yorkers wanted to know, why had this crane crashed to the ground so catastrophically? Much like the city's signature skyscrapers, the answer could be found by looking upwards.
This was New York winter, and on the morning of the collapse, it was both windy and snowing.
Not a hurricane or a storm type of wind. It was windy. It was a cold winter day.
But with a crane this tall, a typical winter's day can be enough to create catastrophe. As civil engineer Adrian Brugger knows only too well.
Wind is an incredibly strong force on cranes. A normal building or a bridge has a foundation that actually ties that building into the ground. In the case of the crane, it's just sitting on the street.
The key to safe operations with any crane is balance. And the taller the crane, the more sideways force the wind is likely to exert on it. So these monster machines have to work within strict limits.
In the case of the crane, if we have any sort of lateral force pushing on this crane, which has this incredibly long footprint, that can relatively easily topple it, which is why any wind over 20 miles per hour essentially negates the use of this crane. So you can see that it's very susceptible to wind.
On the day of the incident, the wind was gusting between 35 and 48 kilometers per hour. So the crane wasn't actually in operation. It was being lowered to safety.
If you've ever been in downtown New York City, the winds inside those street alleys can be quite intense. So at this point, the operator is just trying as quickly as possible to bring this crane down.
To do this, the more than 170-meter long boom and luffing jib would have to be carefully laid on the street, essentially attempting to park a giant arm longer than a city block.
The strategic way to do this is to pull the boom up as tightly as possible and then actually lower the jib until it hits the roadway. And the jib head actually has a set of wheels that then allow the jib to run along the street and just more or less just allow you to open up the crane on the street flat. You have this 2-block long creature, more or less. It's almost like a dinosaur going to sleep on a New York City street.
And just like when a crane is being operated, balance is key to a safe laydown. But here, the equilibrium was thrown off.
For some reason, the boom actually moves forward, so it lowers an angle. And what happened at the center of mass, along with the wind that is also pushing on the crane from behind, has moved beyond the tipping point where just the feet of the crane can no longer hold the whole structure in place, and the entire system toppled over.
Analyzing the onboard computer, the investigation discovered that the boom was lowered 5 degrees further than expected. And long before the jib was anywhere near the ground, the crane lost balance.
With massive, carefully balanced machines like this, even a gust of wind that we might barely feel can make all the difference.
In the grand scheme of things, 5 degrees might not seem a lot, but here this small amount likely proved catastrophic.
Just as the crane starts tipping, it looks like the crane operator actually pulled back on the boom to pull it back. But you can imagine, if I start tipping forward at that point, if I pull back, I still collapse. Ultimately, this was beyond the point of no return.
If this crane had crashed into a building rather than straight down onto the street, this disaster could have been a lot worse.
After the tragedy, the wrecked crane was dismantled and transported to a yard in Brooklyn for further inspection, while crews went to work repairing crushed pipes and repaving damaged roads.
It took them years to replace pipes in the street, so the aftermath took quite a long time, where the cleanup itself was fairly rapid.
The mayor announced manufacturers' recommendations would immediately be enforced, requiring all tall crawler cranes to lay down in winds of 32 kilometers per hour or more.
The major lessons to be learned from this incident are really that wind is a massive threat to these cranes. That reinforces the fact that we really need to invest not only in operator training, but also in building cranes that are inherently safer.
These cranes might seem rough and ready, but they're incredibly high tech and even have black boxes like an airplane. The hope is that wind-activated safety systems could be introduced to help prevent disasters like this in the future.
So while this was a rare occurrence of a crane toppling over in the middle of New York City, we really hope that safety precautions can be taken so something like this doesn't happen again.
In big engineering, regardless of what you're building, the devil is in the details. Miss just one thing, and the consequences can be catastrophic. Like this disaster in Texas that struck a hospital car park.
More than 100 workers heard a rumbling seconds before the whole thing crashed to the ground.
A collapse that shocked the community.
We got a little bit closer. It was devastating.
And revealed a small but potentially deadly weakness.
This was a mistake that might have led to some tragic consequences.
San Antonio, Texas, a city with a rich history, with its sights firmly set on the future. Lucia Garcia is a lifelong resident.
I am born and raised in San Antonio. It's a place where families come not only to live, but to visit.
For over a decade, this Texan slice of paradise has been growing by the day.
Lots of new buildings going up around San Antonio to accommodate so many people that are moving here. Definitely a place that is fast growing with lots of modern attractions.
As the population boomed, the city's infrastructure had to keep up. That includes vital services like this hospital in northwest San Antonio, which, in 2010, was due for an upgrade.
There was more people coming in to the hospital. There was plans for expansion of more beds and more emergency care.
The $900 million upgrade included a multi-story car park with space for more than 3,000 vehicles.
The bulk of the parking garage was an 11-story structure, but at one end it crossed an access road, so engineers had to build a special 7-story extension called the North Prow.
Step 1 was to build the skeleton before adding the parking decks. Dr. Jack Leifer is an associate professor of engineering science.
What they intended to end up with was essentially a concrete cage of columns and beams that was going to be completely in place before they started to lay the cast concrete floors in.
The first layer would sit above 16 concrete piers, each nearly 5 meters tall and joined by concrete beams, with 6 more layers of columns and beams above, creating a framework, before the decks would be poured. To minimize disruption, the main elements would be precast off-site before being brought on-site for installation.
Using precast elements is a really efficient way to build. It's like assembling flat-pack furniture.
But the big difference is that people and vehicles would depend on this structure holding together perfectly.
And like flat-pack products, to ensure everything lined up correctly, the parts arrived with pre-prepared connections already in place, as Dr. Jack Leifer demonstrates.
When I put this together and twist it together, you can see how they end up perfectly aligned. So threaded connections are used for alignment as well as for strength.
By 2011, the construction crews were making rapid progress, but their fast-tracked project was about to come to a screeching halt. February the 14th. In San Antonio, workers were midway through construction of the multi-story car park. At around 11:38, they reported hearing a loud rumbling and sounded the alarm. The crew rushed to clear the area.
Witnesses reported basketball-sized chunks of concrete falling to the ground. One said he saw columns leaning over.
A security camera across a parking lot captured grainy images of the collapse. News of the disaster spread across the city.
Around 1,500 tons of concrete and steel crashed to earth in less than 10 seconds.
When I first heard about the hospital collapse, I was pretty shocked about it.
First responders and trauma surgeons rushed to the scene.
Thankfully, it did happen in the medical center district, so that way there was help that was close by.
2 workers were injured, 1 seriously, but miraculously, everyone else escaped unharmed.
It's so lucky that workers heard the rumble and raised the alarm. Otherwise, the frame would have collapsed around them, and there could have been multiple fatalities.
An investigation was quickly launched to establish how a routine build could have gone so wrong. The security camera footage offered investigators a significant clue. It showed which columns were the first to collapse. Professor of Engineering Dr. Jack Leifer explains.
What you see is that you have those 4 columns, and the 4 columns were labeled in construction diagrams. Column O is right up against the glass facade. Then you have P, Q, and R.
From the footage, row Q appeared to collapse first. After inspecting the columns, the team discovered the alignment bolts were bent sideways.
These bolts were key to lining things up, but they weren't designed to support the entire structure. Once in place, grout would provide permanent support where the columns met.
This grout is squeezed like toothpaste into the gaps around the bolts. But unlike toothpaste, this grout sets rock solid, supporting the columns above, meaning that the bolts are essentially redundant.
We don't want the building structurally to act like a whole bunch of individual stacked beams. We want the beams to act like one long beam structurally. So the grout allows us to do that.
This isn't any old bathroom filler. This special grout is designed to withstand around 600 kilograms per square centimetre. That's like an adult elephant standing on a 2 centimetre square block.
As investigators scanned the damage, they found no traces of grout, which suggested that a key step had been missed for reasons that remain unknown. And there was a second problem with the bolts themselves.
When they went back after the building collapsed to check whether the bolts were correct or not, they found that they were too small. They found there were some holes in some of the plates that were found to be too large, and that contributed to misalignment that wasn't supposed to be there. In other words, the columns weren't stacked up exactly right. They weren't exactly aligned.
Again, for unknown reasons, the bolts used were not as specified in the design. And another key factor would only exacerbate the car park's instability: a lack of lateral support.
There were supports in place. There were lateral beams in place between P and Q and rows Q and R. But between O and P, there was only one set of temporary supports, and there were supposed to be 7 levels of support. So this face was essentially standing flat. There was nothing supporting it.
This structure was already potentially unstable. The lack of lateral or sideways support made things much worse.
On that day, these factors created nearly deadly results.
As one stack of columns started to collapse, it pulled everything else down with it. This really did come down like a house of cards.
After the investigation, construction began on a new car park, this time with lessons learned.
I would guarantee you that when they built this new and improved version, everything was inspected very carefully, and that no elements of the design were left out.
More than a decade later, the new and improved North Prow still provides the people of San Antonio with essential hospital parking.
If there's one lesson that can be taken from this, it's that whether you're building flat-pack furniture or a 7-story parking garage, you really do need to follow the instructions.
Every piece of iconic engineering is built on innovation. But sometimes that innovation contains a hidden weakness, a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. Like this flashpoint in California, where an entire city district could be wiped from the map.
This doesn't just threaten one building, an entire neighborhood is in danger.
Residents have already had a taste of the risks.
The support of the restaurant separated from the walkway. There was a gap of about 2 feet.
More than 100 years of history could fall into the sea.
Buildings could be pulled off their foundations. I mean, it could be apocalyptic.
This could change the face of San Francisco forever.
San Francisco sprung up during the gold rush and has been growing ever since.
During the gold rush, the population of San Francisco exploded as prospectors flooded in, hoping to strike it rich. The city never looked back, with businesses, residents, and tourists flocking to the city by the bay.
Architectural journalist John King is admiring what 1.5 centuries have built.
It's a big city with a lot of skyscrapers, a lot of buildings. You see these tall towers as high as 1,000 feet.
But the city's gleaming skyline only exists thanks to decades of trade down at the Embarcadero.
You really get a sense of the city's history. You see the ferry building from 1898. This used to be a very robust industrial waterfront. It was the largest port on the West Coast into the 1920s or 30s. And these finger piers all used to have lots of cargo going in and out.
Today, warehouses have given way to trendy cafes. Restaurant manager Flicker McGurran is an Embarcaderan through and through.
When we first started, we were the only waterfront restaurant. I knew that this was something that the locals wanted because I grew up here, and we used to have to go out of town to go and seek this kind of experience. So definitely very lucky to get this beautiful location.
With its long working history, the Embarcadero might seem like one of the oldest parts of the city. But it's actually one of the youngest, at least when it comes to the land that everything is built on.
The Embarcadero and much of San Francisco's bayfront land stand on a 19th century solution to a problem every coastal city faces. Where do you build when you've run out of space? In the early days of the gold rush, ships docked at the northeastern tip of the then small town. But as more space was needed, engineers filled in the mudflats to create a new shoreline, stretching from the Embarcadero west to the Marina District.
The earliest sections of filled soil in San Francisco, a lot of it was torn down from Telegraph Hill, brought in from other areas. It was whatever junk was left behind by people heading to the gold rush.
The bay was littered with abandoned ships. As the city grew, the hulls were swallowed up in the landfill and used to create the new shoreline.
A 5-kilometre sea wall was built to buffer the new land against the bay. It's behind this sea wall that the looming towers of San Francisco's financial district now stand. It wasn't until 3 decades ago that a shocking event revealed how unstable this man-made ground had become. October 17th, 1989. The Bay Area was shaken by a magnitude 6.9 earthquake. This was the largest tremor here since 1906. In Oakland, the Cypress Street Viaduct devastatingly collapsed, as did a span of the Bay Bridge. Incredibly, San Francisco's skyscrapers emerged intact, but structures closer to the bay weren't so lucky. Residents like Flicker were left reeling as the sea wall was damaged.
I was here in the '89 earthquake. We were at the restaurant, roadway separated from the docks, and that was horrendous. The support of the restaurant separated from the walkway, and there was a gap of about, I would say 1.5, 2 feet. So then we had to use a 3/4-inch piece of plywood in order to get into the restaurant.
But just along the coast, the Marina District was hit hardest.
In San Francisco itself, one of the worst affected areas was the Marina District on the city's northern tip, which saw multiple collapsed buildings with dozens damaged beyond repair. Like the Embarcadero, the Marina District was built on the historic landfill.
Embarcaderos knew they'd escaped lightly compared to the Marina District. But if another quake struck, would they and the looming towers suffer the same fate? The threat stems from the days of the gold rush. As experts now know, the old landfill by the bay is more vulnerable than the solid ground inland.
This is where this old inconsistent cocktail of landfill could be in real trouble from a phenomenon known as liquefaction.
Kim Blizniuk is an earthquake geologist.
The Embarcadero is at risk because it sits on a layer of sediment, and because that sediment is near water, the shaking from the earthquake allows for water to move through to the surface of Earth. As the water moves through the surface of Earth, it reaches sediment and saturates that sediment.
When an earthquake hits wet land, it can make the loosely packed soil liquefy or move around like quicksand. For the buildings on top, like the Embarcadero, this creates a dangerously unstable foundation.
As a result, all of the material and buildings on top of the Embarcadero will be shaken and possibly destroyed.
But there's another weakness lurking that threatens to leave the bustling Embarcadero district underwater. The more than century-old seawall itself is under threat.
The Embarcadero seawall is not a masterpiece of construction.
Recent surveys have revealed that the seawall is a cocktail of more than 50 types of concrete, sand, and rock in 23 different sections. There was no master plan. This was organic growth, using whatever was at hand.
A major earthquake could cause the seawall to just lurch forward. And once you lurch forward, everything behind it that maybe is already liquefied, it can just move.
The liquefied historical fill could slip, falling into the San Francisco Bay, taking dozens of towers with it.
You have all the utility lines under the Embarcadero, you have streetcar lines on the Embarcadero, you have the BART and Muni subway tunnel going beneath. All those things can be shut down, buildings can be pulled off their foundations. I mean, it could be apocalyptic.
This sounds like a disaster movie, but the threat is very real. All it would take is for a quake to strike in the wrong place, and the Embarcadero could be devastated.
As the danger looms, geologists like Kim Blizniuk are racing to learn when the next major earthquake might hit.
What I do to better understand earthquakes is I look at the landscape. I walk these faults, and I can assess how fast they've moved over geologic time. That is a fault slip rate. And a fault slip rate is directly correlated to when the fault will rupture next.
Experts predict a 72% chance of a major earthquake in San Francisco within the next 30 years, with the potential to shake the city at levels not seen for over a century.
But the city isn't sitting and waiting for the next big one to strike. Plans are being laid to shore up the seawall so that the Embarcadero and the towers have the best chance of survival.
San Franciscans, to their credit, voted a $425 million bond to start work on the seawall. Just now you're starting to see detailed project proposals starting to be researched and designed.
And citywide, discussions are underway for an early warning system that would buy crucial time, capitalizing on the critical delay between the first jolt from a quake and the destructive waves that follow 10 seconds later.
In those 10 to 15 seconds, we can duck and cover, shut off gas lines, we can stop transit systems, and by doing that, we can save lives.
But for the people of the Embarcadero, the unpredictability of Mother Nature is just part of doing business in the city by the bay.
You just never know what's going to happen. So no, I don't worry about stuff like that. I worry more about getting on an airplane, to tell you the truth.
In big engineering, Designers try to leave a lasting impression on the world. But sometimes big ideas lead to abject failure. Like this construction in Germany. A grand plan to create a dystopian nightmare.
This immense project would lay waste to one of Europe's most iconic capital cities.
An evil empire with a twisted engineering design.
That's the nature of Nazi architecture. It was meant to make the individual feel small and the state feel very large. It's the closest thing to bullying cast in stone.
As Hitler attempted to conquer nature itself.
Some people say that Germania was a fantasy. It was far too ambitious. It was impossible to build.
Berlin, Germany. In recent years, this eye-catching European city has become known as the capital of cool.
After London and Paris, Berlin is now the third most popular tourist destination in Europe, but its reputation as one of the trendiest places on the planet was underground and undiscovered for years.
For decades, it was closed off. A divided remnant of the Cold War. Journalist Ryan Murdoch lives and works in the city and knows all about its bohemian past.
Berlin has always been a remarkably nonconformist corner of a rigidly determined society and culture. It's the sort of place that attracts dropouts and artists and original thinkers.
But nonconformity and free thinking were in stark contrast to the ideology of the city's most infamous ruler, Adolf Hitler.
Hitler always despised the city. He hated the cosmopolitanism of Berlin, and he hated the cynicism and the wit of its inhabitants. And he wanted to remake the entire place into something more fitting for his glorious dreams of an empire that would control all of Europe and potentially the world.
And hidden in a dark corner of the city is this, a little-known concrete legacy of one of the most destructive regimes in history. All that's left of a grand plan to create a world capital known as Germania.
This massive scientific instrument is one of the only remaining traces of Hitler and his architect, Albert Speer's dystopian capital of Germania.
As historian Sean Stewart explains, Germania was intended to permanently memorialize Hitler's power and ideals.
Germania was the vision that Hitler had for the rebuilding of Berlin. And he had the idea that by building this magnificent new city, as he saw it, the idea of the Nazi Party would live on long after he himself had died. It was meant to show the stability and the permanence of this new Reich that was being built, as well as the power and the dynamism of it.
Designed in the 1930s by Hitler and his chief architect Albert Speer, the centerpiece of Germania would be the Volkshalle, or Great Hall, the largest auditorium in the world.
The Volkshalle was meant to accommodate about 180,000 people. It was truly massive. It was meant to be a gathering hall for speeches of Hitler and future leaders of the Reich.
This mega project to overhaul Berlin involved more than just this gigantic hall. It would also include a giant triumphal arch, 3 times the size of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris.
Yet two things stood in Hitler's way: the outbreak of war in Europe and the very ground he was standing on.
The problem that builders have here in Berlin, even today, is the fact that Berlin is built on essentially marshy territory. And so the soil is quite weak and the water table is quite high here. So to build heavy structures in Berlin is a difficult undertaking.
With these difficult building conditions and the war ramping up, Hitler's grand plans were a long shot from the start. So officials devised a way to test the swampy ground before construction officially began. They created a giant concrete structure known as the Schwerbelastungskorper, or heavy load-bearing body.
The idea was to begin with an experiment. If this structure held up to Berlin's marshy ground, then they could scale it up. And Germania, Hitler's vision for a world capital, would go ahead.
So the Schwerbelastungskörper was built to test the ground, basically.
Michael Richter is an architect and specialist on Berlin's underground history.
Der Schwerbelastungskörper als Probe für die Baubarkeit des Triumphbogens ist auf einen Bereich gestellt worden, wo mehr oder weniger auch der Triumphbogen gestanden hätte, um zu schauen, wie sehr der Boden unter der Last des Triumphbogens zusammengedrückt werden würde. Und hat in seiner Belastung simuliert.
The huge concrete cylinder would weigh more than 12,000 tons.
What they wanted to do was to build something that was going to be equal in weight to one of the pillars of the triumphal arch. And for tolerances, they were willing to accept 6 centimeters of subsidence.
Construction began in 1941, and once complete, the 21-meter diameter cylinder perfectly mimicked the ground pressure 1 foot of the arch would exert on the swamp below.
Sie wussten nicht, wie weit es einsinken würde, während man es baut. Und das wollten sie halt 1:1 untersuchen, um dann einen klaren Plan für die Fundamente dieses Triumphbogens zu haben.
But Mother Nature had a surprise in store. The structure sank over 19 centimeters, 3 times more than expected, in just over 2 years.
And so the result was that, of course, the ground wasn't strong enough to support such enormous loads. Some people say that Germania was a fantasy. It was far too ambitious. Albert Speer's father looked at the original version of this model, and he just stood there, and he, according to Speer's memoirs, he just looked at it for a minute, and then 2 minutes passed. He didn't say a word. Then he looked up to his son and said, "You're all mad," and walked out. Didn't say anything more.
For all its hubris, Hitler's regime had got its calculations wrong, dooming the fantasy city from the start.
This is where Germania began and ended. The ground was too soft to support the weight of the triumphal arch they wanted to build here. The water table in Berlin is very shallow, and the soil is a mix of sand and clay. So it's completely the wrong sort of place to build megastructures of this size.
Despite the evidence undermining the arch, one report suggests that Hitler decided to ignore the results completely and planned to go ahead with the Great Hall anyway.
But weight alone wouldn't have been the only problem facing the gigantic dome. Its acoustic design was so flawed that most of the audience wouldn't have been able to hear any speeches made inside the structure.
The dome would be 16 times higher than St. Peter's in Rome. This construction was so big that once filled, it could even generate its own weather.
The designers of the structure were concerned that it would hold so many people, like 180,000 fawning supporters. The moisture of their breath would form clouds near the ceiling. Dutiful citizens would troop to the Volkshall and spend their Saturday afternoons listening to the ranting of the Führer while being rained on indoors.
In the end, Hitler's defeat prevented the doomed project from ever getting fully started. After the war ended, demolition of the Schwerbelastungskörper was declared impossible due to the enormous concrete cylinder's close proximity to multiple residential buildings. Now overgrown by nature, it's another memory of a long, dark period for humanity.
The traces of the Second World War and the Cold War are all around us in Berlin, and this is one of the more bizarre elements of it.
In 1995, the heavy load-bearing body was entered into the list of Berlin's historic buildings, now preserved as the only tangible relic of Nazi urban planning.
This bleak building shows the length that this regime was willing to go to force its will and ideology on even its own people, and serves as a stark reminder of what might have been.